If it's Wednesday, it's the economy. The president touts a better than expected GDP report ahead of another major tariff deadline as the Federal Reserve bucks the president's demands to lower interest rates. Plus, NBC News exclusive reporting on Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's potential plans to run for office in Tennessee in what would be a major leadership shakeup for the Pentagon and President Trump's cabinet. And former Vice President Kamala Harris says she will not run for governor of California, raising speculation of a potential 2028 presidential bid from one of the Democratic Party's most closely watched figures. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington on a day of major headlines about the health of the U.S. economy and the president's frustrations with Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. This afternoon, the Fed again rebuffed the president's demands that it lower interest rates, announcing it will keep rates steady as was expected. What was not expected, two Fed governors dissenting in that decision out of the 11 members who cast a vote. Now, that hasn't happened in more than 30 years. Both dissenters were Trump appointees calling for rates to be cut. Here's what Powell told reporters when asked about the dissent.
On the dissents, what you want from everybody and also from a dissenter is a clear explanation of what your thinking is and what are the arguments you're making, and we had that today. So I think basically this was quite a good meeting all around the table where people were thought carefully about this and put their positions out there.
The Fed's decision coming as the White House touts a stronger than expected GDP report showing that the U.S. economy grew at a 3% rate in the second quarter of the year, reversing a first quarter economic contraction. Now, the volatility in the numbers has been exacerbated by the president's tariff agenda and trade war threats, which have roiled U.S. imports and exports, causing huge fluctuations in parts of the data. At the White House today, the president boasted about the resilience of the U.S. economy, criticized Fed Chair Jerome Powell, and defended his calls to lower rates when pressed by NBC's Gabe Gutierrez. Take a look.
Higher interest rates are making it harder for veterans to refinance. In a stronger than expected GDP report this morning, what do you say to analysts who worry that lowering interest rates would actually lead to inflation?
Well, if that happens, then we just raise them. What you do is you lower them, and let's see if there's inflation. Right now, there's no inflation. Everybody thought there would be. All we have is billions of dollars of cash pouring into our country from other countries that took advantage of us for many, many years.
This all comes less than 48 hours before the Trump administration's self-imposed August 1st deadline for countries to reach trade deals with the U.S. to avoid new tariffs. The president insisting today that the deadline will not be extended, a claim his administration has made before, while also threatening India with huge trade penalties for buying oil from Russia. Meanwhile, new polling shows that Americans' views of the economy and the president's handling of it remain underwater. In fact, just 38% say the economy is getting better. According to a recent Wall Street Journal poll, 46% say it's getting worse. In that same poll, just 44% of Americans approve of President Trump's handling of the economy. And a recent Fox News poll finds that 36% of Americans, a little more than a third, approve of his handling of tariffs. We are going to get to the economy in just a moment, but first we do have some breaking news to tell you about. We are getting a verdict in the murder trial of a Colorado dentist accused of killing his wife by poisoning her protein shakes. He has been found guilty on 6 of 7 counts, including murder in the first degree. NBC News correspondent Camilla Bernal joins me now with more. Also with us is defense attorney and NBC News legal analyst Misty Maris. But Camilla, let me start with you. What did we hear in court just now?
We just heard a lot of guilty verdicts. So the most serious of them being that murder charge. He was accused of killing his wife with numerous poisons, including putting eye drops in her protein shakes. And the jury found that he did so. He planned it deliberately and caused his wife of 23 years to die at the hospital. So along with that murder charge, which is the one that carries life in prison without the possibility of parole, there were other charges related to some of his behavior in prison, including asking people to essentially testify for him in a way that obviously was not right, and asking people, including his his daughter to alter some of the evidence in this case. He had asked his daughter to make a deep fake video of his now late wife, essentially asking for these poisons. So the jury found him guilty of all of these charges, which included tampering with evidence and perjury and solicitation of first-degree murder, because he also, as he talked to other inmates, tried to get some of the people involved in this case killed. That included the lead detective in this case. So the jury found him guilty of all of those charges and then found him not guilty of aiding in suicide. And this was a big part of the defense. They had argued that Angela essentially was broken, that she had been broken because of the fact that he cheated on her so many times. And because of that, they had argued that she actually decided or wanted to die by suicide. The jury finding that that was not the case and finding him not guilty of aiding in that suicide. So a lot of different charges here, most of them guilty. And again, the jury took this case yesterday. They deliberated throughout the day today and then came back with this mostly guilty verdict for this former Colorado dentist who has been accused and found guilty of poisoning his wife with just a number of poisons. It was just incredible to watch this trial and to watch the closing arguments as the prosecution laid out this case and really pointed to all of these different poisons and even said, you know, who goes out in the middle of the night to buy 12 different bottles of eye drops? These were poisons that did not taste or did not smell, so that he was able to put them in. He used the pills, that he changed the pills essentially for poison, pills that she was taking, and also put the poison into her IV, which is what prosecutors believe essentially led to her death. So a lot of details in this case, and the jury now, Kristen, finding him guilty of killing his wife.
Camilla, before I get to Misty, and it's just devastating to hear you tick through all of those details. They did have a mountain of evidence, including internet searches, right? Apparently he had gone online and looked up how to do this, how much poison would be necessary to kill a human being.
Yeah, and even, you know, how much poison would be detected in an autopsy. He had a number of Google searches, of YouTube searches, searching the different poisons, and also searching, you know, how to make essentially a murder look like a heart attack. So prosecutors had argued he did not search how to stop my wife from committing suicide. Instead, he had searched the complete opposite and had been trying to figure out how to kill his wife, all the while he was having an affair with someone else. So prosecutors pointed to the motive being wanting to be out of the marriage. They said he wanted money from a life insurance policy, but also saying he didn't want to split the money 50-50, and even saying this is a person that wanted to save his image as a dentist, as someone who practiced the Mormon religion. So prosecutors even laying out a motive in this case, which sometimes is very rare in these types of cases.
Yeah, just extraordinary details. Misty, let me go over to you the length of time that the jury deliberated and, as Camilla is saying, mostly guilty verdicts. What do you make of what happened today in court?
You know, I'm actually surprised that the jury didn't come back sooner. The prosecution had just a tremendous amount of electronic evidence. Of course, we had those internet searches, but couple that with text messages. Couple that with text messages to a woman that he was in a relationship with, 4,000 messages exchanged, started the relationship in February through the day of his wife's death on March 18th. All of those text messages, orders for these poisons online, all of this memorialized in the electronic footprint that was so damaging to the defense. The defense making the argument that nobody could really say how these poisons got into Angela's system. And so maybe it was suicide, raising that as an alternative explanation, the jury not buying it. And keep in mind, he was convicted of first-degree murder. That is premeditated murder. That means that they bought what prosecution had laid out, that this was planned in advance, and there was a systematic plan to kill his wife up to and including the days that she was actually in the hospital. He was still administering these poisons, cyanide, to her. So this was a verdict I expected, a little more time than I thought it would take, but truly justice in this case, given what we learned during the trial.
And I wonder, Misty, given what Camillo is saying, that he actually enlisted his daughter to help him try to cover up part of his crime, could there be more charges at some point in this case?
So these charges that were brought actually post-incarceration, he was already arrested and he was behind bars. He was communicating with his daughter. He was communicating with another inmate, Kristen, both in writing, trying to manufacture and fabricate evidence that would support his defense that Angela had suicidal ideations, both coming forward and providing that information to law enforcement. That led to these solicitation charges. They were charges on their own. But, Kristen, I'll go a step further and say it wasn't just the crime, it's also the cover-up. Not only did that relate to the new charges that were brought against him, it also spoke specifically to the guilty mind, which is obviously what the jury found. Why fabricate this evidence? Why speak to your daughter about actually creating a deep fake of Angela? So think about how personal that is, asking her to do that if you didn't commit the crime. So it was really twofold, the way that prosecutors presented this evidence, not only for those other convictions, but also relating to that guilty mind and intent element.
Well, it is just devastating all around. And the breaking news, again, incredibly significant, that James Craig has been found guilty of the various charges he was facing, including first-degree murder. Camilla Bernal, Misty Maris, thank you both so much for helping to break that case down for us. We do want to turn back now to the day's big news on the economy. I'm joined now by NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake and CNBC senior economics reporter Steve Leisman and Thomas Hoenig, former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. He's now a distinguished senior fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it. Garrett, let me start with you. The president has not been shy at all about trying to pressure the Fed to cut interest rates. What has his reaction been to today's decision?
Well, he's clearly frustrated but not surprised. Even before the decision was announced, he was at an event in the Roosevelt Room talking about his frustration over this and the sort of acknowledgement that rates would stay where they were. I will say that today his critique seemed more policy-focused than it's been in recent weeks, perhaps an admission of some kind that he's not ultimately going to fire the Fed chair for his obstinance on not cutting rates or his handling of the renovations of the Fed headquarters. The president really keeping his remarks focused on the idea that he believes cutting rates would stimulate the housing market and make it possible for home buyers, particularly first-time home buyers, to get in. He also, kind of played chicken a little bit on the interest rate question and what it would do for inflation, saying, bring it down. If inflation pops back up, we'll just raise the rates back up, as though it were just that simple. So I think you're seeing a president who's frustrated, but also has come to terms with the fact that he's not going to get what he wants from Jerome Powell.
And Garrett, of course, we are getting these new poll numbers on the economy, the president underwater in his handling of the economy. I wonder what your sources there are telling you at the White House about the level of frustration. 44% approve, 55% disapprove. This was really his top issue. This was one of the big reasons, Garrett, why he was elected.
Yeah, the president believes economy and immigration were the two key issues that got him elected. And I think there is frustration within the White House and certainly from the president that these numbers aren't better. You've heard it in the way that he's talked about the Jeffrey Epstein case in the last 2 weeks or so, arguing that he's got, in his view, the best 6 months of any president, perhaps in history, and it's all being overshadowed. I mean, for President Trump, most problems are seen through the lens of marketing, and that they don't feel like that they're getting enough credit publicly for the way that the economy has been pretty sturdy. Unemployment has, remained level. GDP has grown, albeit with some sort of interesting side stories behind the top line number. And they just simply don't feel like they're getting the credit that they deserve. A knockdown of the interest rate, something that might stimulate the housing market. Perhaps the president believes that could turn the storytelling around here. But it's just not gone that way.
And Garrett, finally, President Trump announced steep penalties on India, including a 25% tariff for what he's been calling unfair trade practices and for its relationship with Russia. How did it get to this point? Because as you've been reporting, he talked about early on his optimism that he could get a trade deal with India.
There was widespread optimism within the White House going back months that India would be one of the first countries to strike a trade deal with the United States after Prime Minister Modi visited Washington, and I think it was the first month of this Trump administration. That has not come to pass, and it's not entirely clear why. The president talks about India, although it has, as if it had some of the highest tariff rates anywhere in the world. That's simply not true. The effective or average tariff rate that India placed on American imports in 2022, the most recent year we can see the full numbers, was something like 5%. I mean, this was not necessarily a totally closed-off market to the United States. So there's something going on here that's deeper than the headlines have suggested, and we just don't know what it is yet, Kristen. But I will say, as with all things related to this president, this is clearly an active negotiation. So it's entirely possible that what we saw on Truth Social today and the way that the president was talking about this earlier today is meant to help push a deal a little bit closer to completion that may have nothing to do with what we actually heard from the president today.
Well, we know you'll stay on top of all of it. Garrett Haake, thank you so much. Steve Leisman, let me turn to you here now on set. You obviously have covered Jerome Powell extensively. What do you make of his decision not to raise rates? Certainly not a surprise to anyone, but the messaging as well, that there may be a softening.
Well, the big surprise was that he kind of pushed us off from a rate cut or thinking about a rate cut in September. So he was even more what we call hawkish in the Fed watching business than we thought. Dovish is the guy who wants to cut rates. Hawkish is the guy who wants to keep them tight. In fact, you got a hawk right here, Tom Hoenig, who you covered for many years, but who would maybe deny that. But anyway, the point is we sort of, the market was kind of sleepwalking to the September rate cut. We'll get there eventually. But then you look at stuff like this India tariff. We don't know. I asked the chair, listen, you have a better idea what these tariffs are going to be. Are you more certain now? Can you now tell us when you might cut? He said, no, we have a lot of things that we have to know yet. I'll give you an example. We believe, according to a report by Goldman Sachs, that we've seen about a 7 percentage point increase in the average tariff rate being paid. They think that what was going to happen is it's going to double and go to 14 percentage points. So we have not yet seen even half of what we think we're going to get in the economy from the tariffs. I think that's what's holding back the Fed. They do not want to see a repeat of 2022 and a broader increase in inflation.
And the fact that you had two governors dissenting wasn't completely unexpected. At the same time, it's a big quite deal. Extraordinary, right?
It hasn't happened since 1993.
Talk about why it's such a big deal and what are the implications?
Well, it's a big deal because sometimes, and I've been doing this for a couple of decades now, the dissents can tell you where the Fed's going. It can lead the way, and sometimes it leads you astray. In other words, it's an out there kind of thing. I think they make a case for cutting rates. You can make a case right now, but not if you're the one who's responsible. If it's your watch that you're on and you're the Fed chair, I think you want to be extra careful. Very simply, the Fed is shooting for a 2% average inflation rate. It's 2.7% now. It's higher than they want. They do not want to send the signal that they're going to be weak on inflation because then they think you'll get the inflation that you feared.
And we know, of course, that Jerome Powell doesn't have much longer left in his term. President Trump saying, yeah, he has some ideas in mind about who he might want to replace him with when his term is up. Do you think these Fed governors were perhaps auditioning to be the next Fed
I think
chair?
there was some politics involved in that. And it's important to realize, you said there were two dissents. Well, guess what? There were 9 people voting for holding rates right now. 3 other governors along with the chair. Several other presidents, I believe it was 5 other presidents from around the country. So what's interesting, Kristen, is when you look at how the market is priced down the road, they do not see the replacement for Powell coming in with guns blazing, I'm going to cut rates. It's a very modest outlook in the futures market. So they don't see, you've got to get the whole board with you. And by the way, you've got to bring the market with you because the Fed operates through the market. If the market is resistant, we had back in September the Fed cut, long-term yields went up. The Fed would want to be very careful that doesn't happen again.
It's such an important point and a reminder. It's not a unilateral decision that Jerome Powell
No, it's not just all Powell. The chair's powerful, but not all powerful.
Steve Leisman, thank you so much. Pleasure. It's always great to see you. Always great to have your perspective. I do now want to go to Thomas Hoenig. Thomas, thank you so much for being here. And I want to start with the Fed's decision to leave rates unchanged. What do you make of their move? And as Steve was just saying, the fact that Jerome Powell signaled he might hold steady through September.
Well, I was not at all surprised by the fact that he kept rates as they are, and I wasn't also at all surprised that you had two dissents. Since one of those two dissents, Christopher Waller, gave a speech that was very, very dovish, calling for a rate cut. So that was on the table even going into the meeting. So I think that's pretty important. And the thing is, there's two things I think you ought to be aware of. One is tariffs are going to temporarily, at least temporarily, raise prices. They know that, the Fed knows that, and they need to be aware and not play to that by easing in anticipation that this may slow the economy down, but risk even more inflation. So they are playing it careful, as they should, relative to the effects of the tariffs. But the other thing that Powell and the other members are very reluctant to talk about, and that's fiscal policy, which is a big factor forward, since we just passed a budget bill that will have expenditures of about $7 trillion, which is an increase, and revenues of only $5 trillion. So we have a huge deficit coming. That will be stimulative in and of itself. And there will be enormous pressure on the Fed to buy some of that to keep interest rates from rising because of the demand, I should say, because of the supply of additional new debt, about $2 trillion a year. And that's got to be a big factor in their thinking longer term. And I think one of the reasons they take September kind of off the table as an automatic.
And just to follow up with you on the two governors who voted against holding rates steady, you just heard my conversation with Steve Leisman. What did you make of their decision? I know that you weren't surprised by it. Do you think that it goes beyond politics, potentially auditioning for to be the next Fed chair? What did you think was at the root of that?
Well, I think, like Steve, I think there were some issues about being, if you're going to err on the side of easy now, because there's at least a case to be made, and they did make their case, at least he did in his speech, and I think that's a big part of the factor. And I think the other is just being convinced that that's what they ought to do on the margin, and going ahead and descending at this time to make their point. And like Steve, I don't know that it means September is on the table. I think there's these other factors that I mentioned that will have to be very carefully weighed as they come closer to September, because if they ease too soon with the amount of stimulus that is coming from the fiscal side, they could have an inflationary problem on their hands that they really don't want to have.
And let's talk about the GDP report that we got today, 3%, stronger than expected, but embedded within that, still some signs of softening. What did you make of that number?
Yeah, I thought the number was, in a sense, I think the chairman did it right. You average out, because of the number was really based on a major reduction in imports, which actually adds to GDP in a perverse sort of way, from the first quarter, where they increased imports to stock for the future with tariffs coming, which lowered GDP. So on average, you got about 1.6% growth, which really isn't outrageous at all. Number one. And number two, consumer spending, which also recovered somewhat, is still 1.2% for the second quarter, which is fairly moderate. So things are, in one sense, slowing. And that caused the chairman to emphasize the fact that unemployment is still 4.1%. Open job openings are still over 7 million. So he's emphasizing the labor side of it more than as not having to cut more than the inflation side, which is really well above target at 2.7%. So he's on solid ground for not raising rates right now.
All right. Well, we got a lot of new data today, so we really appreciate your helping us to break down all of the facts and figures and to understand it a little bit better. Thomas Hoenig, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
Great to have you here. Coming up, the deepening divide on Capitol Hill over Israel's handling of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, as some Democratic and Republican lawmakers who are staunchly pro-Israel publicly rebuke the Israeli government. Plus, from the war room to the campaign trail, NBC News exclusive reporting on the private conversations Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has had on launching a potential run for office. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As Israel is facing increased international pressure to do more to address the already dire food crisis unfolding in the Gaza Strip, President Trump is now dispatching his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, to Israel tomorrow, where he is expected to meet with officials to discuss the next steps in addressing the situation in the Gaza Strip. Earlier this week, President Trump publicly broke with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, acknowledging there is, quote, real starvation in Gaza, and announcing the U.S. would set up food centers through the White House, though the White House has yet to provide many details about that plan. NBC News International correspondent Matt Bradley is in Tel Aviv and filed this report, and we do want to warn our audience some of the images are disturbing and difficult to watch.
Well, Gaza's nightmare is continuing now on the fourth day since the Israelis loosened the restrictions on aid getting into the Gaza Strip, allowing for airdrops and for aid to go in via land through border crossings through trucks. And you're seeing on your screens this desperate images of Palestinians flooding the airdrop areas, flooding those trucks, and in many cases sparking violence. This is just a tragedy that is continuing day after day. Again, despite the fact that aid is coming in, we're hearing from Palestinian health officials in the Gaza Strip, which is ruled by Hamas, that another 7 people have died of malnutrition and famine-related conditions. That brings the total death toll from that cause, from hunger-related conditions, up to 158. About 88 of those are children, who are by far much more vulnerable. Now, the folks that we've been talking to in the Gaza Strip say that it is hard to get these parcels. You can see why on your screen, the difficulty it is to try to reach them, to try to get past others. And once the food is in the hands of those who need it most, some are finding it to be unsatisfying, particularly for children who need protein in order to survive, especially to reduce or reverse the ravages of malnutrition that have already affected their small bodies. They need things like meat or eggs. A lot of these parcels are containing things like rice, dried pasta, lentils, beans. These are things that, while nourishing, aren't necessarily going to help with children who are really, really suffering from malnutrition already, as well as the effects of poor hygiene in some of these camps that people are displaced into, and injuries sustained during the relentless Israeli attacks on the Gaza Strip. Now, as we're seeing this humanitarian crisis continue, we're also seeing countries like the United Kingdom coming out and saying, as they did yesterday, that they will finally recognize a Palestinian state. Now, this would make the UK the second G7 country to do so. The UK has said they will do that if they hear, or if the Israelis don't come to some sort of agreement in the Gaza Strip, a ceasefire, or if they don't relieve the desperation, the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. We've already heard from a statement yesterday that some other G7 countries are considering doing the same.
Matt Bradley, thank you for that report. Joining me now is NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Julie Sirkin. So, Julie, let's talk about this. We know that when President Trump was in Scotland, he announced that the U.S. would be setting up these food centers in the Gaza Strip. Rank and file members of his party are on board with the U.S., some of them providing more aid to Gaza. But what's the debate? What are you watching for there?
Well, Marjorie Taylor Greene called this a genocide. I have not found a single other Republican lawmaker in the House or Senate to back up what she's saying. In fact, Kristen, if you talk to rank and file senators, of course, because the House is out this week, Senator Bernie Moreno, for example, said there cannot be any military personnel on the ground. There cannot be boots on the ground. They also reject this notion that Israel is the country blocking aid to going into Gaza. And on the other side, you have Republican leadership, including Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who I pressed on this issue, given the down-spiraling support for Benjamin Netanyahu in this country, given Trump's very own comments. And I also asked him if Congress will have a role to play in this, something he didn't answer. Watch this.
I share the president's view. I think that the humanitarian thing, obviously, when you see people hurting in a need like that, is to want to help meet that need and alleviate that pain. I think all of us want to see obviously a peaceful solution there that gets the hostages freed and ends the reign and rule of Hamas in the region. But in the meantime, do everything we can to ease the pain and the hunger that's afflicting so many of the people in that region.
Do you think what's happening in Gaza is a genocide? I know Marjorie Taylor Greene called it that. Do you think Congress has some sort of role to play in solving the hunger crisis?
No.
And Graham kind of matches more of the tone that we're hearing from most Republicans up here, Kristen, but Democrats are also divided on this issue. Senator Bernie Sanders, again tonight, is going to go to the Senate floor, I'm told, to try to introduce resolution to block weapons sales to Israel because he says that country is involved in starving the people of Gaza. Senator John Fetterman, for example, told us he is a hard no on that, and he actually called Marjorie Taylor Greene crazy pants, and he doesn't care what she has to say.
Well, fireworks flying over this issue that has gripped everyone across the country and world. I do want to shift gears a little bit, Julie, and ask you about another issue that lawmakers have been talking about, the Jeffrey Epstein controversy. Ghislaine Maxwell, who is, of course, serving a 20-year prison sentence for aiding and abetting that sex trafficking ring by Epstein, said she would be willing to testify before Congress in exchange for immunity. Where do those discussions stand right now, Julie?
Well, Kristen, last night her lawyer sent a lengthy list of demands to the House Oversight Committee. The Republican chairman of that panel, James Comer, a spokesperson for him, rejecting her number one ask of immunity or even a pardon from the president in order to have that conversation with this committee. But she had a laundry list of other demands. It includes taking her off premises outside of the prison where her lawyers say she'll be more comfortable to answer these kinds of political questions. It also includes waiting until after the Supreme Court decides whether or not to hear Maxwell's conviction appeal request. We already know that's not happening until the end of September, them even deciding whether to move forward on that. And you have a date of August 11th where members of this committee want to hear from her. So at this point, it makes sense that she would plead the fifth, although I will tell you, I just heard, and my colleague Melanie Zanona as well, from Republicans and Democrats on the Oversight Committee, they have not yet sent a formal response back to Maxwell's lawyer. And we know that Robert Garcia, who is the top Democrat, said they are having negotiations on the side with Maxwell's team. So we'll see where it goes from here. Meanwhile, though, you have Senator Dick Durbin in the Senate wanting to see the transcripts, the videos of Maxwell's conversation with Todd Blanche, number 2 at the DOJ. You also have an effort by Senate Democrats today to try and force the administration's hand in releasing the Epstein files. Schumer saying that they'll take it all the way to the court if it doesn't happen. So a lot of parallel efforts all over this Epstein case happening. One thing is clear, though, Kristen, it is not going away anytime soon.
That is for sure. Julie Sirkin, thank you so much for your great and comprehensive reporting. We really appreciate it, as always. Coming up after the break, entering the 2028 chat, we're following new developments in the so-called invisible primary race to be the next Democratic nominee for president. The panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Stay with us. Welcome back. Turning now to a dramatic scene that played out on the Senate floor yesterday as tempers flared inside the Democratic Party over its strategy to fight back against the president's agenda. It began when New Jersey Senator Cory Booker unexpectedly tried to sink a bipartisan package of police funding bills that had unanimously sailed through the Senate Judiciary Committee, which he sits on. Booker, who is often mentioned as a potential 2028 presidential hopeful, railed against his party, warning that the legislation would be politically weaponized by President Trump. That prompted a heated response from fellow Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar, another potential 2028 presidential candidate, who accused Senator Booker of grandstanding. Take a look at some of this heated back and forth.
We are standing at a moment where our president is eviscerating the Constitution of the United States of America, and we're willing to go along with that today. No, not on my watch.
They are bipartisan, common sense legislation. They passed the Judiciary Committee unanimously. And I can't help it if someone couldn't change their schedule to be there. I think that these hearings should mean something, and that people should be saying the same thing they say on Police Week when those people are sitting out there in the uniform who have lost loved ones, as they say on this Senate floor.
And what are the very people here elected to defend the Constitution of the United States saying, oh, well, today, let's look the other way and pass some resources that won't go to Connecticut, that won't go to Illinois, that won't go to New York, that will go to the states he likes. That is complicity with an authoritarian leader who is trashing our Constitution. It's time for Democrats to have a backbone. It's time for us to fight. It's time for us to draw lines.
Nevada Democratic Senator Catherine Cortez Masto then admonished Senator Booker after just 2 of the 5 bipartisan law enforcement bills were able to pass. Look.
At the end of the day, the Democrats in general, and what I saw today, it should be less about rhetoric and more about and making points for social media and groups out there. It should be actually working together. We can support our communities, keep them safe, and take on Donald Trump and his bad policies. We can do both. It's not, I don't think you have to choose one or the other.
Joining me now on set is Michael LaRosa, former special assistant to President Biden and former spokesman for First Lady Jill Biden, and Republican strategist Doug Heye. Thanks to both of you for being here. We are going to get to the drama on the Senate floor in just a moment, but I have to get to you first on this breaking news, Michael LaRosa. The fact that former Vice President Kamala Harris announced today that she is not going to run for governor of California. What was your reaction? What do you make of it? Is it a sign that she's in when it comes to 2028 and the presidential run?
I think it probably does mean she's going to run again. But I think it was a good call because if you look at what happened in 2024, she ran significantly behind President Biden in her own home state of California. She lost 2 million votes compared to Biden 4 years earlier. So I don't even know if she could have cleared the field, and that would have been problematic for her in 2028. I think it was probably a good instinct.
Doug, how are Republicans seeing this announcement today by the former vice president?
Oh, they're mostly using memes and telling jokes, and, the sort of political rhetoric you could expect. But I also think it was a smart move for Harris because there are two options for her. She could lose, shades of Richard Nixon in 1962, or even worse, she could win and have a real job to do, which would not allow her to campaign. As a brand new governor, you can't start touring the rest of the country to campaign for another office the way Newsom's doing right now, because he's been there for a while.
Yeah, it's a great point, Michael. I think when people look at the possibility of a Kamala Harris run for office again, they, of course, go back to former President Joe Biden, the questions that are swirling and, quite frankly, growing around how those who are closest to him handled his mental acuity, of course, leading up to that devastating debate performance.
Yeah.
There are a lot of questions that people like Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg are going to have to answer if they do, in fact, decide to run for office.
Absolutely. It's going to be a litmus test for any Democrat who decides to run. And my advice would be just answer the question. Don't dodge. Don't pivot. Don't be evasive, which is exactly what people hate about what the Biden people did to the press and to voters. So my advice to all of them is answer the question, answer it now, move on.
And if she does run, there's a different question that she has to answer. And that's the question of whether or not she can be a good or a better candidate than she was this last time she ran. So, perfect example, right? There was this whole conversation of, well, should Kamala Harris go on Joe Rogan or not? I think that misses the point. The question is, and say what?
Yes.
So if she doesn't have that real message to drive forward and isn't a better candidate, then I think we've already seen this movie before.
That's a really great point. And, of course, her past political history will be in focus. And as Doug is saying, the questions about her viability and whether she can win a national campaign. And the broader question, whenever you bring up a Kamala Harris or Governor Gavin Newsom, by the way, the question is, can a Democrat from California win a national election? What say you? Do you think that that makes it more challenging?
No, I don't subscribe to the theory. I think that voters really could care less about resume. They care more about personality. They gravitate towards personality. Does California have a compelling personality to put up? I don't know. I don't know if anybody who has a record as an elected official or has been elected to anything has a good chance of winning. I think Democrats would be better served with somebody who has never served in public office yet, that has other experiences to offer.
Yeah, and of course we have to get through the midterms first, but there's still a lot of attention on 2028 and this floor fight on the Senate that we saw. Let me start with you, since it's your party. Cory Booker, Amy Klobuchar, with this really heated rhetoric toward each other. And in fact, I think we have a little bit more sound here. This is Senator Booker as he left the floor yesterday. Let's take a look.
There's a lot of us in this caucus that want to fight. And what's bothering me right now is we don't see enough fight in this caucus. I hear everywhere, when are Democrats going to fight more? This was a day we could have stood together and fought, but instead, we had folks coming forward that just wanted to be complicit in the status quo.
I see a lot of Democrats fighting, but in different ways.
Correct.
What do you make of what unfolded?
I don't know what message he took away from 2024, but even in his home state of New Jersey, it shifted 6 points. They lost flipped 3 counties that President Biden won 4 years earlier, one that President Biden won by 16 points. So I don't know what map he's looking at. I'm not sure he's drawing the right lessons. Voters really want to see people fight, but not obstruct for the sake of obstruction, not reflexively opposing the president, and especially when it comes to law enforcement. Senator Booker, unfortunately, the problem that he presented for Chuck Schumer yesterday is that the things he said and the things that he did in trying to prevent resources from getting to law enforcement doesn't help our recruits like Roy Cooper in North Carolina. It doesn't help Sherrod Brown if he's going to run in Ohio. These are states that want to feel safe, and they don't trust Democrats, and he gave them a reason not to continue not to trust us.
Yeah, Doug, what do you make of what we witnessed on the floor and the fact that you are sort of seeing a number of different approaches to taking on Donald Trump right now? You're seeing what we hear from Cory Booker. You're seeing some of the governors walk a fine line, like Governor Whitmer, for example. But then Governor Pritzker, for example, is more heated in his rhetoric.
When you get a text message in the middle of the afternoon that says, "Quick, turn on C-SPAN," you know you're in for something good. So it was fun to watch yesterday afternoon. But look, governors and senators have very different jobs. Legislators don't necessarily do anything in the sense that executives do. They have states to run. They have different priorities. But what I saw with what Senator Booker said reminded me a lot of the House Freedom Caucus. And what I mean by that is the more I hear the word fight, the more I hear an attitude, but I don't hear an actual plan to land a punch, to knock down your opponent, to win the round, to win the fight. You can say fight over and over again, and you usually use an F-bomb with that, and that shows how angry you are. But where is the plan to win? And that's what I didn't see from Biden.
I also think he was picking a fight with the wrong senator. I mean, Senator Masto is largely responsible for helping Democrats take back and win the Senate in 2020. We picked up 3 Senate seats that we had not turned Democrat in over 2 decades. Yeah. She's won twice in a purple state. She knows what it takes to run tough races, and that was just her hand is on the pulse of what Democrats need to be doing on policy and politics.
Well, and of course the question is, where does it go from here? Ruben Gallego, among those who are announcing he's going to New Hampshire. We're seeing a lot of these possible contenders, Doug, going to these early voting states. Who do you have your eye on? And to this argument, it's really the message, right? I mean, Democrats will say we failed to capture the pocketbook issues that energized voters.
I don't say that. Some Democrats do, but go ahead.
But the question, I think, is have they gotten any closer to finding their footing on messaging?
No, they haven't. They don't have a messaging really at this point. And we saw a memo come out leaked from the DNC that basically said to what Senator Booker said, cuss more. Demonstrate your anger by dropping F-bombs. And the lack of F-bombs is not why Democrats don't have a message nationally. And it's why, ultimately, I start by looking at governors. So you mentioned Governor Whitmer, of course, Gavin Newsom, Wes Moore, not far away in Maryland. Governors are doers. Mayors are doers. Those types of candidates can progress pretty far.
But we also haven't had a governor selected as our nominee in over 35 years, since I was in first grade. Yeah. If you look at the last open election, I mean, governors didn't even make it into the voting part of the Democratic primary contest. I think it's going to come down to personality, less so about message.
All right. And of course, again, we have to get through the midterms first, but it's so fascinating to talk about 2028 as well. Michael, Doug, thank you so much. Great conversation. Coming up next, after tumultuous 6 months leading the Pentagon, we've got exclusive new NBC News reporting that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth may be looking for an off-ramp in the form of a run for Tennessee governor. Stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press now. Defense Secretary Hegseth has had a tumultuous 6 months at the helm of the Pentagon. And according to a new NBC News exclusive report, he may already be looking for an off-ramp. According to 2 people who've spoken directly to Secretary Hegseth, the embattled Pentagon chief has privately discussed the idea of running for office next year for governor of Tennessee. In a statement, the Pentagon said Secretary Hegseth's focus remains solely on serving under President Trump and advancing the America First mission of the Department of Defense. Joining me now is one of the reporters on that byline, NBC News national security reporter Gordon Lubold. Gordon, thank you so much for being here. So what more are you learning about this possible decision by Secretary Hegseth?
Sure. So what we reported is that these are discussions, not that he's made a decision, not that it's even on track necessarily, but that he's had these discussions with a number of people, and that and so there's a political calendar that would kind of run this, and there may be a White House calendar that runs this that maybe pushes him to make a decision. But the idea is that he's always wanted to run for office. He has run for office, but lost in Minnesota in 2012. This would be an opportunity for him to get into political office, but also be, as you say, an off-ramp from this kind of tumultuous 6 months or so.
Well, let me follow up with you. I mean, Gordon, it has only been 6 months. What does it say that there are these types of conversations and ruminations happening behind the scenes?
Well, I think it's like so potentially it would be the perfect off-ramp for him, because it is something he would like to do. President Trump does not like to necessarily, fire people, and this would be the perfect way to kind of move on, as National Security Advisor Mike Waltz did potentially if he gets confirmed at the UN. And so there's been all these different things, as you know, and viewers know, that the Signal Gate. There's been a lot of miscommunications on aid for Ukraine, and so a number of different things, and also just Hegseth's front office has just been itself very tumultuous in the last several months.
And to what extent, obviously, President Trump watching all of this very closely, there's the possibility of a Trump endorsement. How much is that looming over his decision? And who, if he were to decide to get into the race, who might his potential rivals be?
Right. So Senator Martha Blackburn, senator from Tennessee, is definitely, we understand, very interested in that gubernatorial race. That would be a big decider, right? If Trump decides to endorse her, I think makes it hard for Hegseth to decide to run, but vice versa as well, if he decides to endorse Hegseth as a way to get him out the door. And would it be a competitive race if he were to get in, or? Oh, I think so. Yeah. I mean, and there's eligibility issues there for Hegseth in Tennessee, even though he's a resident. But those could be waived with the state legislature vote or whatever. But it'd certainly be competitive if they go head-to-head. All right. Gordon, thank you so much for your exclusive reporting. Fantastic scoop. We really appreciate it. Gordon Lubold, thank you. Still to come, a live report on the investigation into that shocking midair collision in D.C. earlier this year as hearings begin in Washington. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Turning now to the very latest in the government's investigation into that deadly mid-air collision between an American Airlines passenger plane and a military helicopter near Reagan National Airport. The tragic incident back in January killed all 67 people on board both aircraft. It was viewed by some experts as a wake-up call amid concerns about aviation safety, air traffic control staffing, and overcrowded airspace. Today, the National Transportation Safety Board began a 3-day investigatory hearing into the crash. NTSB Chair Jennifer Hoenig offered her condolences to some of the victims' families in attendance.
I'd like to take a moment to address the families who lost loved ones in this tragedy. On behalf of the entire agency, we are so sorry for your loss. We wish we would have met you in different circumstances, but please know that we are working diligently to make sure we know what occurred, how it occurred, and to prevent it from ever happening again.
Joining me now is NBC's Gary Grumbach, who's been following today's hearing. And Gary, of course, you were at the scene when that horrific crash occurred. Talk us through what some of the other key takeaways were from today's hearing.
So today's big focus was on the Army helicopter, that Black Hawk, and there's several issues that have come up already with it. One, it didn't have a specific kind of location monitoring on the Black Hawk, and it's not specific to that specific incident here. None of these military Black Hawks have this location monitoring. So if you're a commercial airline, you can see each other. You can see the other commercial airlines in the sky. You cannot see the military aircraft. There's bipartisan legislation over at Capitol Hill to try to fix that that already. The second issue that really came up today was the idea of the helicopter altitude reader. It was incorrect. It was 100 to 150 feet off of what it was where they actually were. And so the tower at DCA was seeing one number, the pilots in the Black Hawk were seeing another number, and they were actually at a third number, completely different. That really did upset the NTSB member here. Here's what he had to say.
You're telling me it's going to be 2 months before you tell them that there's a discrepancy in their altitude? Could you hurry it up? I hope every Army aviator is not having to watch the NTSB.gov live stream to figure out that there's a discrepancy in their altitudes of the planes that are flying around us. Sorry for my frustration.
So as you can imagine here, Kristen, an incredibly emotionally charged hearing on all sides with recommendations to come in the days ahead.
Yeah, what do we expect in the coming days as this hearing unfolds?
So this is a 3-day hearing. Every day, every session is going to be about a different topic, and they are really going to dive deep into every single minute of this incident, how it unfolded, what happened, who was responsible, what could have happened to avoid this. And by the anniversary of this event on January 30th of next year, they hope to have a full report out with dozens of recommendations that they hope can either happen or get into law and then happen.
And just very quickly, the victims' families were there, an emotional day for them.
Yeah, there were several victims' families there. They were tearing up in the hearing. These are folks that have had their entire lives changed because of an incident that occurred here in Washington, D.C. You can see some of that video there. It's just heartbreaking to hear some of their stories. Of course, many of the people on this plane were under the age of 18. These were ice skaters coming back from Wichita. Just a heartbreaking scene here.
One of the most heartbreaking details of this entire story. Gary, thank you so much for covering it. We really appreciate it. We are back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now, but the news continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.